Welcome back, CIS 1400, and welcome to Module 12, the last module of the semester. We're going to take a step back this week from like object-oriented design and getting into like tricky algorithm stuff and things of that nature, and do something that's kind of interesting and I think might be a little bit fun for you. We're going to talk about event-driven programming and building a graphical user interface, or what we would call a GUI. In Python, there are lots of different ways to do that. In many languages, there are lots of ways to do that. Many times there's editors that you can use to kind of drag and drop and put different widgets and things like that on an applet or on a window for yourself. But we're going to do it kind of the old school way. We're going to actually kind of code everything out the way that we need to. And I'm going to show you a new library called TKEnter. That'll allow us to kind of build a form for ourselves that we can do something with, and then we'll get into what your activity is for this week, which will be kind of open-ended, up to you on how you want to do it and what you want to do. So hopefully you'll enjoy that a little bit. But I'm going to get into and make a Python file. I'm going to call it a unit converter, right? Because what my goal here is going to be is to create a window that kind of pops up. And what it's going to allow me to do is enter in like a temperature in Fahrenheit, say, and then calculate what the same temperature is in Celsius. Okay, so a very simple program, but I'm going to do it so that a window pops up on the screen instead of doing the work in the console. Okay, so to kind of get into building the window and the graphical user interface, first thing we have to do is kind of work with a library called TKEnter. Now, there's a couple ways that you can do this. You can import TKEnter, and if you're using Python 3, it's TKEnter, like that. But I'm going to do it a slightly different way. I'm going to use the from import, because I'd like to get everything from that library without having to go TKEnter every single time. So I'm going to go from TKEnter import star, because that'll give me the ability to build the window and the buttons and the labels and the entry fields and the text fields and whatever else I want without having to precede every single one of them with TKEnter or TK or whatever I want to call it. So this gives me some options here, and what I can do is now pull stuff from this library. And what you can pull from this library is all sorts of stuff. You can pull buttons and canvases so that you can draw certain stuff, check buttons, entry widgets, frames, labels, label frames, list boxes, menus, and the list goes on and on and on. So anything you can think about that would go into like a regular program that you use every day, like a Microsoft Word or Google Chrome or whatever it is, all of that stuff is built off of some sort of graphical user interface. And they have these widgets in there, and they're styled certain ways and different things like that. So this gives us the ability to do it. Now I'm going to a library that I found through Google, fbot.org, and there are all sorts of different documentations that you can find online for TKEnter, and I actually listed a few that you can go to in the lab document. So I'm going to advise you to kind of go there and poke around, and I'm not going to go through the entire library because that could take hours to do. But what I am going to do is do a couple of things just to give you the kind of gist of how it's going to work, and then I'm going to let you kind of go off on your own and kind of play with some of these other widgets or items that you can work with on your own and style them the way that you want and put them in places that you want. And it's not hard to do, it's just honestly more tedious than anything. So I'm going to have you build something small and simple, but I'm going to come back to this reference a few times, I'm sure, just to kind of look through and show you how you can kind of deal with certain things. But first things first, if we're going to create a graphical user interface, we need a window to put it in. So let's do that. I like to call my window master. Okay, and what we're going to do is just build a bunch of objects, and the objects that we're going to build are coming from the TKEnter library. And they give us the ability to do certain things. They have methods that are associated with them and different fields that are associated with them, like the width and height of the object, or its geometry, or where it's being placed, or where items in it are being placed, or what color they are, and so on and so forth. So the master is going to be the window that holds everything. So I call that the master window. You can technically call it anything you want, but from the TKEnter library, to initialize it, there's a constructor called TK. Okay, and that's it. That will help you build a window. And then the next thing you need to do in order to see your program kind of run is that an event-driven program is in this perpetual loop where it's always looking for some sort of interaction with it. And to get there, you have to call upon the master object, okay, dot main loop, and what that will do is allow the window to show up and then keep cycling over your program over and over and over again infinitely many times as fast as it possibly can to wait for some sort of interaction that it's going to have with it. And so if I just do that and run this, you should see a little window pop up. It's running. Let's see. Oh, there it is. It's off on my main screen. So it kind of pops up here on my main screen. Okay, and you'll see that it has basic geometry and that the title of it's TK, and it's running, and there it is. Okay, so it looks like I'm going to have to kind of bounce back and forth. So let me do this real quick and bring my PyCharm back to my main desktop. If I can, yeah. I want to shrink that. Okay, so now I'll see everything that I need to see. Okay. Couple things about the master. We can do all sorts of stuff with it. First thing we can do is we can change the title if we want. So master.title. Okay, that's just a field of the, or a method of the window that allows me to type in a string. And that string will now become the title to the window. So if I run it again, and you'll see the window pop up, and there it is. Unit converter, change from TK to unit converter. Now, if I don't particularly like the size of this window, I can change the geometry of it. And again, this one takes another string. It's kind of odd that it would take a string, but it takes a string. And in this string, I can label the dimensions, the width by the height. And so let's say I wanted it 400 by 200, 400 pixels by 200 pixels. And so I don't want to debug this, I want to actually run it. Okay. And let's look at it again. Now it's a little bit wider than it is tall. It was originally 200 by 200, now it's 400 by 200. I'm going to keep it a pretty small window because I don't need anything very big for my particular program that I'm going to make. Because the program I'm going to make is going to be pretty basic. It's going to have a couple of different labels in there and some entry fields and a very simple button that I can click on that will convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius. Okay, but essentially that's what we have. Okay, and so now it's a matter of trying to get those other things on the master or in whatever frame that you're going to put in there, so you can have different sections to it and different geometries, the ability to put things onto the widget. So we'll talk about some of those different ideas that we have as we go. So realistically now it comes down to, well, what do you want to do? Well, it's always nice to kind of have a drawing of what you're going to do prior to getting into it so you can kind of arrange things that you want to do. But one of the things that you can do is first you kind of have to look at the geometry managers. So there's 3 of them with TKEnter. There's the Pack Geometry Manager, the Grid Geometry Manager, and the Place Geometry Manager. The Pack is probably the easiest to use of them all. And essentially what it will do is every time you tell some object that you want to put on there to pack onto the item that you're telling it to go into, it'll basically just kind of put it in there. In whatever order you put those commands, it'll just put it in the applet or in the window and kind of just fill it in as best as it sees it can fit. You cannot mix this with the grid in the master window. It just won't work. But basically what you're going to do is make the idea, and then when you pack it on there, it just kind of places them in there, and there's not much that you can do with it. So you can kind of see how it works when I say like listbox.pack. It just places it in there, and then if I put it in some other things, it'll start to expand it and fill it, and the window gets a little bit bigger. When you pack different things, so pack this label, pack this label, pack this label, you can kind of see that they just kind of happen one at a time, one over the other, and as you go through it. Now you can do different things with them and obviously pack and fill it by the X coordinate, that way it kind of stretches it out, and go through certain things. You can add them to the left and right and so on and so forth. And pack is fine, it really is, if you just want to add stuff quickly to an interface and just have the stuff on there. The other geometry managers that you have to work with, and the one that I'm going to work with today, is called the Grid Geometry Manager. And essentially what this does is it kind of lays things out in a grid pattern for you that has rows and columns. And those rows and columns can be sized appropriately, and you can stretch over certain rows and columns, so do span. So if you're familiar with some like HTML, like tables and things like that, you can span over certain numbers of rows and columns to make things cells bigger. It's a nice little geometry manager because now you have control as to where things get placed and how they're going to look, and it comes out in this nice tabular format where now things are kind of lined up easily and pretty simple to work with. Okay, so this is the one that I'm going to work with first, and you can choose to work with it as well, or any other kind of geometry manager that you want, so feel free to kind of look through. So this is essentially what they started with. They had a bunch of different cells in their table, and then eventually it came down to this, where it looks like here's the first row, the second row, the third row, and then you've got one column, two columns, and then that third and fourth column right here. But this one actually took up 2 rows and 2 columns, which is kind of nice and how it all kind of worked through. Okay, so that's the one I'm going to use. This last one that you could use is called the Place Geometry Manager. And what the Place Geometry Manager will do is it allows you to take whatever widget that you're going to use and put it at a very specific spot by pixels. You can put it exactly where you want relative to, say, the upper left-hand corner of the main window that you're working with or frame that you're working with. You can tell it to have a relative width and a relative height to the things around it, or a relative X and a relative Y to the things around it. I find that this one's more complicated to work with, but if you're looking for absolute precision in your application, then this is something you might want to investigate in how you're going to work with it. So the Place Geometry Manager can be very useful. If you're using some sort of actual tool where you can kind of drag and drop these widgets on there, this is pretty much what it's going to use as well, because now I can just say I want it exactly there, and you can pick it up and move it however you want. Okay, so those are your geometry managers, and we're going to use the grid one today, but you can expand and do any one that you wish. So first of all, let's talk about, so there's our geometry managers. Let's also talk about some of the things that you can use. So let's get into some of the widgets. So like the button widget, the label widget, entry widget, those are the 3 that I'm going to use in this particular program, but you can use any number of these as you want. Radio buttons are often very useful, so we'll kind of go through these a little bit. So the button widget is exactly what you would think. It's just simply a button that shows up on the page that you can click and do different things with. They're really simple to make and work with, so you create the variable name for the object, you call it a button, you tell it where you want it to show up. So on my master, you can say different arguments that you'd like to work with. They call them options that you can work with, and there's all sorts of options, like the text, what I want it to say on there, what function do I want it to relate to when I click on it, so you can give it a command, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then you could pad it and say what width and height it's going to be and all sorts of stuff. So when you're looking at, say, this documentation, this is basically the constructor for it, how you build it. And then these are all the different options that you can put in. So you can change its active background, its active foreground, where it's anchored, the background color, bitmap. So if there's like an image option that you want to kind of put in there, the border width, the command, the compound, the cursor, how you want the cursor to change when it shows in there, the font, the foreground, the height, so on and so forth. So any of these options that you can work with. Some of them are a little bit complicated to work with, and they require other things to be done in your program, like with the geometry manager to work, but we'll get into some of that as we go. So there's kind of the button that we'll use. We're also going to use the entry widget. Okay, so instead of going through all of this, we can talk about it as we kind of get into it. But again, you've got some code here that you can look at and all of the different things that you can do. Okay, so here's how you make it, and there's all the options you can configure it with. And the last one that we're going to use today is the label widget. The label widget is simply just text on the frame, so that we'll talk about that as we go. So all sorts of different documentation that you can kind of go through. So let's make a couple things. I think first thing we'll do is we'll make a title for the thing. So we'll just kind of say that it's going to be a temperature converter. Here's how I like to name my objects so that they're a little bit easier to work with, I always kind of precede them with an abbreviation of the type of object it's going to be. So if I'm going to make a label, I'm going to go LBL, and then I like to give it a name. So for me, it's going to be title, okay? And you can kind of put an underscore in there if you want. I think camel casing is just fine. But again, you need to give it a unique identifier so that you can use it and do different things with it. So this is called a label, okay? And I'm going to put it in the master. Okay, so that's the window that's going to hold it. If you had a frame that you're going to put it in, you can name that frame. And then I'm going to set one of the options, the text option, okay, equal to a temperature converter. Okay. And so there you go. Now, if I ran this, even though I've made it, you're not going to see it because I didn't put it in the grid. So you're going to see that I have this, but nothing really shows up. So I still have it. So I need to actually place it in the grid with one of those geometry managers. So I either need to pack it or place it in my grid. So I'll kind of show you what the pack looks like real quick and now how it works. So I would do something like this. Okay, I'm going to go LBL title.pack. Okay, and if I do that, now you'll see that it shows up. Okay, temperature converter. But the pack again just kind of puts it dead center right where it needs to be. Okay, now I'm actually going to change that and I'm going to go to grid and I'm going to change the geometry manager. And in grid, you have a couple options that you want to work with. First of all, I want to say row equals 0 and maybe column equals 0 or whatever we want to do. Now, if the column's going to be 0 or the row is going to be 0, you don't necessarily have to state that. It just kind of defaults to 0, 0. But I'm going to put it at 0 anyways, and it's going to look identical to the pack, except now it's left aligned because everything's kind of justified to the left here as we start working through, because it's going to assume that there's going to be some columns here that you're going to work with, and so it kind of splits the middle down the row. So we have about 2 columns to work with until we make more. Okay, and it's not going to make them until we actually build them ourselves. So here it kind of changes things up just a little bit, but we've got the idea. Okay. And I can come in here and I can change all sorts of things with it, like the background color and whatnot. But again, I'm going to keep it pretty simple. You can play with all of those things as we go. Now, as I'm building, I like to make it so that I've got my window built, and then I start making all of my widgets. Okay. All right. And then I like to place them all in the thing. So I'll put my geometry. Okay. So every time I make something, I'm going to put it up here, and then I'll put it down here in the grid so I can see what it's going to do. Okay. So first off, now let's make a couple other things. So I'm going to make 2 more labels and 2 entry fields that kind of go with those things. So first thing, I'm going to make something that's called LBL Fahrenheit. So I'm going to call it LBL far, and that's equal to a label. And again, it's going to go on the master, and its text is going to be equal to Fahrenheit, right? And we'll leave it at that for now. And I'm going to go with LBL Celsius, so LBL cell. I'm going to go label, master, and again, text equals Celsius. Oops. All right. And I can start putting those into the grid as well. So I can go LBL far.grid. Now for this one, I'm going to kind of put it underneath where I was before. So I'm going to go with row 1. Row 0, by anyways, is on the very top of the applet, and as you increase in number, it gets further and further down, whereas column 0 is on the far left-hand side of the applet. As you increase, it goes further to the right. Okay, and they'll always kind of auto-adjust to be the correct size for the largest element in that row or column. So here I'm going to put this in row 1 and column 0, and I'm going to put LBL cell in, oops, I want grid. Oh, I said grid info, I just want grid. This is going to go in row 2, column 0. Okay, so everything's kind of stacked on top of each other. And if I run that, you're going to see I get this. And notice how it's going to kind of center these things. Maybe it's not what I want, and I can kind of get in and justify that a little bit easier. But realistically, what we have here is a column that kind of breaks off right here. This column is just as big as this piece, so that's all it is. It kind of comes down right through here, and everything gets centered in there. Okay, and since this is the largest item in the column, these things get centered in here. I might want to move those to the right or move those to the left, and we can start talking about how we're going to do that a little bit later. But first, let's just kind of get everything on there, and then we'll kind of play with what we want. Okay. All right, next thing I want is I want to put two text boxes or text fields next to both those things. So I'm going to create what we call entry objects. So I'm going to go entry Fahrenheit equals an entry object. All right, again, it's going to go in the master. And that's not going to have any text associated with it, just a blank entry object. I'm going to go entry cell, okay, equals entry, oops, and that's going to go in the master as well, okay, and let's place those in the grid. So I'm going to go ent far and that grid, and that's going to go right next to the label for far, so it's going to go in row 1 and column 1. Okay, and the entry for Celsius is going to go in row 2, column 1. Okay, so now it's right next to each other, and so we're going to put that there. And you'll see now I've got these two kind of text fields that pop up. And again, I could like change the background color on those or the foreground color and work through it. And so now you can really kind of see the columns that we're using. So they're just going to be as big as they need to be. So here now I've got column 1 kind of ends right here all the way through. Column 2 ends right here. So my widget's probably a little bit bigger than it needs to be, but it works out just fine. I could change the width and height on these things and play with them. Again, something for you to kind of investigate as you go through, but I'll show you where you can do all that stuff at very soon. And the last thing, let's get a button on the page, and then we'll start playing with how we want it to look. So the last thing I want to do is make a button widget. So we're going to go btn, and I'm going to call this convert, because that's what it's going to say on the button, and when I click it I want it to convert from whatever I type in Fahrenheit into Celsius. So we're going to make that a button. Okay, and again, that's going to go in the master, and the text on the button, I'm going to make it equal to convert so that it actually assumes like it's going to do something. And then we're going to add that button where we need to go. So we'll go btn convert.grid, okay? And I'm going to put this in row 2, so it's below everything else. No, I'm going to put it in row 3, sorry. And I'm going to go column 1, so it's not under the labels, but under like the text fields. Okay. And let's run it and see what it looks like. And now it's starting to look like something that I can actually work with. So I've got this convert button. I can click the crap out of it. It doesn't do anything, but I can. And I've got everything that I want. And it's looking pretty decent, okay? I can play with a couple things to get it to look a little better, but it's looking pretty good, okay? So now let's kind of play with some of the things to make it look exactly the way that we want. For instance, I might want these labels here to kind of be right up next to the entry field so it looks a little cleaner. So let's do that first and foremost. So to do that, what I need to do is kind of look at a couple things about the label, okay? And I can look down into the options and see how I want to work with it. And there's one of these options called anchor, okay? And what it will do is control where in the label the text or image should be located. So I can use all sorts of different things about this. The default is called center, so that's why it puts it in the center of the item, but I can tell it to go to the north, the northeast, the east, the west, so on and so forth. So if you think about it as one big box and your label's in the middle of it, you can tell it to kind of go to the top, the bottom, the corners, or the right side or left side, okay? So let's kind of go through and try that and change the anchor position to the east side of the cell, okay? So here I've got my label, comma, anchor, equals, and we just say E for east, and we'll do that also for Celsius. Right? And let's run it and see what happens. And we've got our item here, and it doesn't appear anything really happened. Okay? So that's the old one. Let's run it one more time just to make sure. And it didn't, okay? And that's because of the way that the grid is worked out. The grid kind of, it doesn't fill the entire cell. So what we did here was we pushed it to the east, but the cell itself is really only as big as this. What we really needed to do is to fill out the cell so that it fits in this row and this column and fills out the whole thing, and that way we can push it to the east or west. So that really comes down to the geometry and the pattern of it. So if I look at this label, there is something else that I can do with it, and let's see if I can find it for you. Whoops. If I look back at the geometry manager for grid, there are lots of different things that I can work with, and one of them is called, let's see if I can find it, sticky. Okay, it defines how to expand the widget if the resulting cell is larger than the widget itself. So essentially what I have is a cell that's bigger than the widget itself, but the widget itself is only going to fill a small chunk of it. And when I said anchor east, it only went to the east of that small chunk. What I'd like to do is fill the cell up so that it fits the entire cell of my geometry manager. And so what I want to do is kind of span it out, okay? So for example, I could do a couple of things. I can just move the widget over to the east, or I can have it just fill the whole thing by doing kind of a west plus east or an east plus west, so I can expand it across the whole thing. And so that's kind of what I'm going to work with here. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to go back to my geometry manager here, and for my label, I'm going to go sticky equals E plus W. Okay, east plus west, or west plus east, it'll do the same thing. And what that'll do is kind of stretch it out horizontally so that it works just fine. So I'm going to do the same thing here. And now when I run this, we get it to move over, because now I've got this entire cell filled out, and my anchor allowed me to push it all the way to the right, which is kind of neat. So now it looks a little bit cleaner, so I know that this is the Fahrenheit box and this is the Celsius box, and it seems to be working out just fine. I could also just span this across the whole thing, so now it's centered across both, and that's something we can do. But for right now, I think we've got the right idea here and what I want to work with. Okay, so let's get into actually making that button do something. To keep this video kind of brief, because right now I click on it and nothing happens. And in order to do that, what I need is something called a callback function. I need a function. If I'm going to have action in my widget or in my application here, I need a function to perform those actions. So we can first kind of define that function and know that these things, all these widgets, are global variables or objects that I can work with and pull into any function I define, because they're not defined in a function, so they have a global scope. So I'm going to come up here, and this is where I'm going to make all my functions, callback functions. Okay. And the first one I'm going to make is something called convert. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab the value from this entry, okay, called Fahrenheit entry, and then I want to set the text or insert the text of the that it calculates into the Celsius entry box. Okay, and there's lots of different ways to do this, but first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the value that's in the Fahrenheit entry box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go entFar.get, and what that will do is give me the value that's put in there, okay? And you can see that if I do, yeah, so what that does is it just kind of gives it to me, but what it gives it to me is a version as a string. What I'd like to do is convert it to a float so that I can work with it mathematically, okay? And just keep things simple. Now I'm going to go through some calculations. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with the Celsius value. And if you looked up the formula, it's pretty simple. It's 5/9, okay, times whatever the Fahrenheit value, okay. So actually let's just change this from value to farval, okay. Farval minus 32. So if you take the Fahrenheit value, deduct 32 from it, and then multiply it by 5/9, you'll get your temperature in Celsius. And so what I'd like to do now is insert that item into the text field or into the entry widget for the Celsius. So just to make sure that there's nothing already there, I'm going to delete whatever's there. If there's nothing, that's fine. So that's pretty easy. I'm going to go with entry cell.delete, okay? And what I'd like to do is delete everything in there from the 0 index to the very end. Okay, so there's things that I can do there if you look those up. And what I'd like to do is then insert. Okay, and I'd like to insert starting at index 0. So I can push it towards the center if I want, but at index 0, I want to insert the stringed version of the cell val. Okay, and so now that I've got this function made and it does what I want it to do, it grabs the value from the entry far, okay, stars it here, converts it, and then inserts it into the other entry object. I need to call this function when the button's clicked, okay? So really that comes down to here. There's a couple different ways to attach kind of what we call an event or a function, a callback function to a widget. Some widgets have options available to them. So for instance, my button widget, if I go back to that, okay, has an option called command. Command is an option where it's a function or method that is called when the button is pressed. The callback can be a function, a bound method, or any other callable Python object. If this option is not used, nothing will happen when the user presses the button. So let's go ahead and try that first and foremost. So what I can do here is add another option called command. Okay, set it equal to. And what I'd like to do is tell it what function to run. Now this is a little different than you're used to. Anytime you call a function, you name the function. For me it's convert, okay, and you generally put the parentheses there. But when you're using this, you don't put the parentheses. You just say call convert, no parentheses, and it will go right to that, okay? So now if I run it and look, okay, I type something in here like 32 degrees Fahrenheit should be 0 degrees Celsius, and it prints 0.0. Okay? If I type in 212 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when water boils, and water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, so I know it's working pretty well. Okay? That's one way to kind of put stuff into an event. Another way, instead of using the command, would be to do something a little bit different, and that's called an event binding. So what an event binding is, and you can do this to any widget you want, is you can bind a particular event to it and have it do something when that event happens. And what I mean by event is a left mouse click, a right mouse click, maybe a keyboard is, a button on the keyboard is pressed. So it's, again, perpetually listening for certain stuff, and I can bind an event to this button that when I click on it a certain way, it does something. So one way to do that would be btn convert.bind, okay? And there are all sorts of different things that you can bind to it. For me, I want to bind button 1 to it, and that's the left mouse click to it. And what I'd like it to do when that is reached, okay, is to call convert. Again, no parentheses, okay? So that's one way to kind of go through it. And so if I ran this again, you'll see that when I click on it with the left-hand side, if I type in something here, convert, oops, let's try this again. Close first. Make sure I got the right one open. What did I do? Oh, I forgot. As soon as you bind something, there is a parameter you have to put here, and it has to be something that it can catch an event. Now, you may not use that event as you go through. You can use that event and do something with it, but here now I have to add that in, and now if I run it, I can type in something like 32, convert with the left button, click, and go for it. Now the trick here is if I do 100 and I click with the right mouse button, nothing happens. So it really kind of forces you to make sure that you're using it correctly, but if I click with the left, now it works. And if I type in 212, right, left, it goes exactly the way that I want it to. So there's a couple different ways to do it. Obviously the easiest one is, instead of a binding, is to use the command function, okay, or the command option, which I'm going to leave in there for you, and I'll just kind of comment this out because I'm going to give you this code. But there's so many different ways that you can do this, and feel free to use whatever option works best for you, okay? But if I'm going to do this, then I need to take out that bit there to make sure that it works appropriately. But all in all, there's all sorts of different ways to do all these things, and you just have to find what kind of works for you. Try to stay organized when you're going through things. I like having the callback functions up near the top, making my window, making my widgets, putting my widgets in the grid. Make sure that this is always the last line of code in your program, because it kind of has to build everything first and then say, okay, now I'll start going through that main loop. That's kind of the driving part of your program. So all sorts of stuff that you can work with. When it comes to your last activity for the class, you have pretty much complete freedom over what you want to make, okay? Now, one thing you can't make is a temperature converter like I did, but you can make all sorts of different things. You want to make a different unit converter for like weights, or for measurements, you know, feet to inches, inches to yards, miles to kilometers, that's all fine. You want to do weight measurements, so pounds to kilograms or something of that nature. Or if you want to do miles per hour to kilometers per hour, that's fine. If you want to go a little bit deeper and build something like a basic 4-function calculator and really kind of stretch yourself, you're more than welcome to. Or if you want to do a different type of program, I've labeled a couple ideas in the lab document as well. Again, you're more than welcome to. There'll be a couple things that you have to make sure that you hit. You'll need a couple of labels. You'll need to make sure that there's an entry field somewhere so I can type some information in. You'll need to make sure that there's a button on there and another feature, some other kind of widget that I didn't cover in this little lecture. So you'll have to do some diving and some research and making sure that you can work with it appropriately. Maybe a checkbox or a radio button or a text area or the canvas, or any number of different things that you can work with. Okay? So kind of freedom, up to you. It doesn't have to be crazy complex. Okay? You'll need at least a function to work with. Or two, I can't remember what I listed in there, but you'll see what you need to do, and again, make something that's unique and up to you, maybe something useful for you, but have some fun with it, and let me know when you're finished and turn it in. And if I can provide you with any feedback, again, label any of those questions in the discussion forum or email me directly, and we'll work on it. So I'm going to post this up here very shortly, and enjoy the last week. No final exam for the class, so once you're done, you're done. So it's been fun, and again, thank you very much for sticking with us throughout these 12 weeks, and I wish you the best of luck and happy holidays. So bye.